At its height, the Maya lowlands supported over 2 million people. Within 200 years, 90% of them were gone. The cities stood empty for centuries before Europeans ever arrived. This is not a story of conquest. This is something far more complicated and far more terrifying. To understand what happened to the Maya, you first need to understand what the Maya actually were, because most people have the wrong picture entirely. When people hear the Maya, they imagine ruins, vine-covered pyramids, lost cities in the jungle. But those ruins weren't always ruins. At their peak, they were the centers of one of the most sophisticated civilizations ever to exist on this planet. The Maya independently invented the concept of zero, centuries before it reached Europe from India. Their astronomers tracked the movement of Venus with an accuracy that modern scientists can verify to within 2 hours of precision. They built cities of 100,000 people with no iron tools, no wheels for transport, and no pack animals larger than a dog. They recorded their history, their religion, their science, and their royal dynasties in a fully developed writing system. The only one in the pre-Columbian Americas capable of expressing any thought in any language. This was not a primitive people in a jungle. This was a civilization. And then, between roughly 800 and 1000 CE, something happened. City after city went quiet. The inscriptions stopped. Tikal, a city that at its peak housed nearly 100,000 people, was abandoned. Copán, where Maya astronomers had calculated the length of the solar year more accurately than the Julian calendar, was abandoned. Palenque, Quirigua, Caracal, abandoned. Over 40 major cities across the southern Maya lowlands fell silent within 2 centuries. No invading army did this. There are no mass burial sites suggesting plague wiped them out. No volcano, no single flood, no obvious catastrophe marks the moment of collapse. The buildings were left standing. The last inscriptions are sometimes mid-thought, as if the scribes simply put down the chisel and walked away. The jungle moved in, and for nearly 1,000 years, the outside world did not know these cities had ever existed. That is the mystery. And the answer, when scientists finally began to piece it together, was more disturbing than anyone expected. The first major clue came not from an archaeologist, but from a climatologist drilling sediment cores from the bottom of a lake in the Yucatan Peninsula. In those cores, scientists found a record of rainfall going back thousands of years, encoded in the chemistry of the sediment. And what they found was this: between 800 and 1000 CE, the Maya heartland was hit by 3 catastrophic droughts. Not dry seasons, not bad years, megadroughts, each one lasting decades. The worst struck around 860 CE and again around 910 CE, at precisely the moment the great cities were being abandoned. The Maya were an agricultural civilization. Everything depended on rain. Their reservoirs, carefully engineered systems that stored water through the dry season, could handle normal variation. But they were not built for decades of drastically reduced rainfall. When the reservoirs ran dry, the crops failed. When the crops failed, the cities could no longer feed themselves. But here is where the story becomes far more complicated, because drought alone does not explain the scale of what happened, and scientists digging deeper into the evidence began finding something else. In pollen records preserved in lake sediments across the region, researchers found evidence of massive deforestation. The Maya had been clearing forest for agriculture, for construction, for fuel, for centuries. By 800 CE, vast stretches of the southern lowlands had been stripped of their tree cover, and this created a feedback loop that the Maya could not have understood and could not have stopped. Fewer trees meant less moisture retained in the soil. Less moisture meant less rainfall. Less rainfall meant worse droughts. The Maya had, over generations, made their own environment more vulnerable to exactly the kind of climate stress that was about to destroy them. At the same time, the political situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Maya were never a unified empire. They were a network of city-states, each ruled by a divine king, each competing with its neighbors for prestige, for trade routes, for captives, for agricultural land. In good times, this competition produced some of the most extraordinary art and architecture in human history. In bad times, it became something else entirely. As the droughts deepened and food grew scarce, the warfare between city-states intensified. Inscriptions from the terminal classic period, the scholar's name for these final decades, show an escalating spiral of conflict. Cities attacked cities. Kings captured and sacrificed rival kings. Trade networks that had sustained the region for centuries began to break down as routes became unsafe and political trust collapsed. And as the fighting intensified, it became increasingly impossible to coordinate any kind of collective response to the environmental crisis unfolding across the entire region. There was no one to call for help. There was no central authority capable of organizing the redistribution of food, the engineering of new water systems, or the managed relocation of populations. Every city-state king was simultaneously dealing with his own drought, his own food crisis, his own military threats, and trying to maintain the political legitimacy that depended on his ability to deliver prosperity to his people. When a king can no longer deliver rain through ritual, can no longer feed his subjects, can no longer defend the city from rivals, he loses the mandate that justifies his authority. And when that happens, people leave. Not in a sudden exodus, gradually, family by family, village by village, over decades. They moved north toward the coastal cities that had access to cenotes, the natural limestone sinkholes that provided fresh water regardless of rainfall. They dispersed into smaller settlements in the forest. They became something different from what they had been. This is the real revelation at the heart of the Maya collapse. It was not one disaster. It was a cascade. Drought reduced food, which triggered warfare, which disrupted trade, which collapsed political authority, which prevented coordinated response, which accelerated the deforestation, which worsened the drought. Each failure made the next one worse. The civilization had no circuit breaker. And once the cascade began, there was no reversing it. The northern cities, Chichen Itza, Uxmal, Koba, survived longer precisely because they had access to cenotes and coastal trade. They held on for centuries after the southern cities fell silent. And the very last independent Maya kingdom, in the remote lakes region of what is now Guatemala, was not conquered by the Spanish until 1697 CE, more than 800 years after Tikal was abandoned. The Maya did not vanish. They transformed. Approximately 7 million people of Maya descent are alive today, speaking Maya languages, maintaining Maya traditions. The civilization did not die, but the great cities of the classic period, those extraordinary monuments to what human beings are capable of when they organize and dream and build together, those cities stand today as empty stone questions that no single answer has ever fully satisfied. Historians and climate scientists now use the Maya collapse as one of the primary case studies in how civilizations fail, and the pattern they identified is not unique to the Maya. The same cascade. Environmental stress overloading political systems, political collapse accelerating economic failure triggering conflict, conflict destroying the capacity for recovery, appears in the Bronze Age collapse, in the fall of the Western Roman Empire, in the decline of the Khmer Empire in Southeast Asia. Every one of those civilizations, at the moment before collapse, believed it was managing. Every one of them had leaders who thought the problems were temporary, who believed the system was resilient enough to absorb the pressure. None of them saw the cascade coming until they were already inside it. The Maya were among the most sophisticated astronomers, mathematicians, and engineers of the ancient world. They could predict eclipses centuries in advance. They could calculate the movements of planets across generations. What they could not calculate was the compounding cost of their own choices. The deforestation, the warfare, the political fragmentation. Interacting with a climate shift they had no way to see coming and no tools to survive. That is not a story about an ancient people who didn't know enough. That is a story about the limits of even the most advanced civilization when the systems it depends on begin to fail simultaneously. The jungle cities were rediscovered by the outside world only in the 1800s, when explorers from Europe and the United States began hacking through the vegetation and finding stone faces staring back at them. Some sites were not mapped until satellite imaging became available in the early 21st century. The full extent of the classic Maya world, its roads, its canals, its suburban settlements spreading for miles around the great centers, is still being revealed. New LIDAR surveys are still finding lost cities beneath the canopy. Whatever we still don't know, the cities are there, standing in the jungle, waiting, asking the same question they have been asking for 1,000 years. How does a civilization that brilliant, that enduring, that creative, simply stop? The answer the Maya left behind is written not in their inscriptions, but in the silence after them, in the empty thrones, in the unfinished carvings, in the trees growing through the palace floors. It is a record not of conquest, but of a system pushed past what it could sustain, until the people who built it had no choice but to leave it behind. Think about that the next time you look at a city and assume it will always be there.